Good evening and welcome to the Associated Black Charities monthly webinar series, Equity at Work. My name is Chrissy Thornton and I am so excited to be on with you this evening. This webinar series serves a number of purposes, but primarily is focused on empowering Black professionals, Black workers, to navigate structural racism and all the ways that it shows up in today's workplace, to give you guidance, resources, a safe space to learn and discuss, and to empower our allies with the information that they need to be impactful as well. Tonight's topic is super exciting: intersectionality at work. Intersectionality is crucial, the concept, in today's society as it recognizes and addresses the diverse and interconnected nature of people's identities. Intersectionality examines how various social categories such as race, gender, class, and sexuality intersect to create unique experience in both discrimination and in privilege. In the workplace, embracing intersectionality means acknowledging that employees don't experience their professional lives in isolation from who they are, their personal identities. This approach fosters an inclusive environment where everyone can feel valued and understood. It also enhances organizational culture by promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, leading to increased innovation, better problem solving, and improved employee morale. For Black people, intersectionality is particularly significant. Black employees often face compounded challenges due to the intersection of race and the other aspects of their identity, such as gender or socioeconomic status. And recognizing these layers of discrimination is essential in creating fair policies and practices that will address specific needs and challenges of professionals. And tonight, I am so excited to welcome our esteemed panelists who I plan to learn so much from this evening to tonight's webinar. And I've asked them to join me on screen at this time. Welcome, welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you, and we're looking for one more to join us. We want to make sure that everyone's on. Yes, all of our esteemed panelists are on, and we're so excited to have you this evening. And I'd like to have each of you, give you rather, the opportunity to introduce yourselves, to tell us as much about yourselves and your work as you would like to, and then also to talk a little bit about why you feel this discussion this evening is uniquely important to have and important to you. So we'll start tonight with Alexandra. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. It's a pleasure to be here and presenting with Rachel and Andrina today. And thank you everyone for attending today's event. So I am Alexandra Sinatus, and I am a director of program at Maryland Humanities. And Maryland Humanities, I will say it's a nonprofit organization. And I will always tell people we specializes in helping people share their stories and elevate stories. And we do this in in different ways. In addition to this, I would say I'm also a researcher, I'm a curator. I do a lot of digital humanities projects. So one of them was to create a digital timeline about the Haitian migration in the United States, which is called the Haitian American Dream Timeline. And also I am a commissioner at the Maryland 250th Commission. So I think I pretty much wear different hats, and I'm excited to be with everyone today.
Excited to have you. Andrina?
Yes, thank you, Chrissy. And thank you, Associated Black Charities, for hosting this. I'm Andrina Sawyer, everyone, and I am the founder and executive director of the Minority Christian Women Entrepreneurs Network. It's a really long name, so we just call it MCWEN for short. And we're a faith-based initiative that supports women of color in business. So whether they're aspiring to be business owners or they're already operational, our goal is to make sure that they know where the resources are and how to use the resources. Outside of running MCWEN, I also do some strategic planning, consulting for nonprofits. I write, I love writing. I'm an immigrant refugee from Sierra Leone, Freetown, Sierra Leone. And yeah, just living life, trying to stay cool this summer.
Welcome, we're so glad to have you. And Rachel.
Good evening, everyone. Such a pleasure to be on this panel. So my name is Rachel Lindley. I'm comfortable with any and all pronouns, but I primarily use they, them. I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Maryland Office of the Public Defender. I'm also a college professor, and I work with several organizations contractually, training primarily legal field organizations on equity and inclusion. To say I'm vested or exceptionally passionate about all things equity and inclusion would be a complete understatement. Navigating difficult conversations around intersectionality is, I don't know, it's so important today because I don't know about everyone else, but when I show up at work, I don't leave like my Blackness at the door. So, and for some, including me, work is the place where I'm reminded about the disparities that exist because of the color of my skin. So I'm just really excited to be here and just kind of share my experiences and my knowledge and hear what everyone else has to say and learn as well.
Thank you. I'm so happy all three of you are here. And what I will say is this is a very important conversation this evening. It will be some people's first exposure to intersectionality, to understanding it, to understand how to advocate for its recognition and how to navigate barriers and challenges that it may present in the workplace. And what I would like to do is make sure that all of those who are joining us tonight are using the chat feature to make sure that you're sharing your experiences, that you're asking questions of our panelists who are here for you to learn from and lending your insights to the conversation. So please be sure to be active this evening. Let's start with a definition, because what I will say is, as someone who considers themselves a practitioner of racial equity, the concept of intersectionality is becoming increasingly important in my mediations, in my executive coaching sessions, in my gaining, I think, understanding from professionals who just want to do better. They need to know more about than just about Blackness, right? And as Rachel said, as we walk into the workplace, we bring everything and all the things that we are with us every single day. And it affects how we show up, how we interpret and perceive information, how we communicate, how we react to things. And so intersectionality is so important, not just because racism is rampant and we have to, of course, continue to advocate and fight against that structural system, but because the ways that our identities intersect with one another can either compound those challenges that we face along with racism, make them more difficult to navigate, or make us just as people more difficult to understand. So I'll open the floor for whoever feels like they have like a really good grasp on what intersectionality is and wants to share it with our audience tonight.
I mean, I don't mind kicking it off, I guess. So I guess the concept of intersectionality, I guess it provides a lens to ensure that like no one is left out of the fight for justice and equal rights. And while it's not meant to create like an oppression hierarchy, it like helps us figure out between equity and equality and analyze how these different forms of oppression and inequality kind of reinforce one another. And if we don't acknowledge it and we ignore that interconnectedness and only focus on like one aspect of a very complex problem, it perpetuates those inequities and those inequalities. And in some cases, the approach may even breed animosity between like different marginalized groups who feel that their struggles are being overlooked or downplayed in favor of others. So I really like the definition of intersectionality from the Center of Intersectional Justice, and I'll try to get it right. But they say it's the concept that describes the ways in which systems of inequality based on gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, class, how they intersect to create a unique dynamic and effect. And that's, I guess, my definition and taking other people's definition of intersectionality.
Absolutely. Anyone want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I really like what Rachel said earlier when she said, I can't leave my Blackness at the door. And, you know, the same for me and other parts of my identity. So my religious identity, my immigration status, my nationality as a Sierra Leonean, all of those things inform who I am, from my social interactions to the types of, you know, the moral compass that I use even in my work. So yeah, so it's the intersection of all of those things and me being able to bring all of me into every conversation, into every space that I'm in. So it's a very simple definition, but it's what I go by. The fact that I should not be forced to fragment parts of myself in order to show up and not suffer discrimination.
So one thing in the research, it was coined by someone named Kimberly Crenshaw, in just 1989. So it's a fairly new concept. Like we talk about this new terminology, we throw in intersectionality, we throw in BIPOC, we throw in these things, and sometimes the understanding and comprehension of what those things mean don't travel as fast as good old racism that we all know and can identify with. And it is, as you all mentioned, a framework for understanding how all these things to combine to create experiences. And I love always when we're talking about anti-Blackness and racism to talk about privilege, because I think the concept of privilege really defines how you experience work, how you experience everything from pay to, opportunity, to advancement and all of these things. And by the nature of your intersectionality, you can drastically lose privilege. And so one of the frameworks that I love to talk about is how, Black women we know are marginalized. We are all facing many uphill battles for equity in workplaces and social settings and in opportunity. But transgendered Black women have even less privilege, right? Like, so there's always a and or, right? Like there's always something that can combine with what already separates and marginalizes you to make your situation even more disadvantaged. And so I think as we'll talk about intersectionality this evening, while there are many positive ways that people can experience intersectionality, for Black people specifically, certain other identities, experiences, and truths about us can alter our privilege even further downward. What do we think about that?
I would say I agree with what you mentioned, Gracie, because I think it's also about understanding the different layers that makes you who you are, which I think one of the things Adrina and also Rachel mentioned. So understanding, I think there's a lot of self-reflection and for you to understand the different layers that makes you who you are, the different layers of your identity as well. But at the same time, knowing even though you have all those different layers, and through these particular layers, there are some components where you might be oppressed, but also there are some components where you also have some privilege. So knowing how to navigate this and also being self-aware of this. So for instance, I am a cisgender woman. So that means when I'm showing up into that particular workplace, my experience might be a little bit different than someone who's actually was queer. Is also similar to someone who actually practice a different type of religion that might not be Christianity. So their experience in the workplace, for instance, someone was Muslim, might be a little bit different and stuff like that. That doesn't mean when we think about the race component or the gender component that in the workplace, Black women are not underpaid, but those particular layers can also take into consideration in how people can actually not only show up in the space, but also how other people in the space interact with them.
Yeah, so we're talking about unique experiences by people who are associated with not one single identity. And so the typical ways that intersectionality will show up are race and gender, which we talk about a lot, specifically as Black women, right? But also we're delving into socioeconomic status and race, like what it means to be low income and Black or low income and queer. Sexual orientation and gender are certain other descriptors that add to intersectionality. Disability or ability, religion and ethnicity, which you brought up, ageism, age, whether it is, that you are someone who is facing ageism or age-related biases because maybe you're a younger age. We're talking about nationality and immigration status. And then, of course, education. And this one was new to me that I didn't even consider until I read it in the research, where it talked about family status, where it talked about how single parents deal with challenges related to their family status, which also tend to pour into their economic status. But then also queer families can face discrimination based on their family structure, and compound all of that with being a Black person. What do you think about all of those different descriptors? And are they ones that you've studied to become more conscious about, or you just experience the world and recognize all of these different identities and people?
Um, for me, I mean, I consider myself a lifelong learner, right? So, while some of the things that you mentioned, I'm checking a lot of those boxes. I am a queer, non-binary individual who happens to present very cisgendered, femme, who does not have a traditional family dynamic. I am an atheist. I am neurodivergent. So I'm just checking all the diversity boxes. But how I navigate that, because I am college educated. I was raised in a high, income bracket, both parents college educated, both parents, again, heterosexual, raised by a male, female who were married, and how that intersects. But so my experience is very unique. So yeah, just because I check the boxes does not mean that I'm very intentional about, again, educating myself and getting to know people and seeing their individuality and their lens and how they navigate life, because that is very specific to them and their journey and their experiences. So yeah, I don't compartmentalize or put people in like boxes, because we can never really know a person. That just gives into stereotypes and generalizations. But it definitely, it does get complicated, and it does compound, and it is heavy and exhausting when you're always navigating what area of the oppression is someone not going to like or appreciate, or again, find a reason to discriminate or other. So yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, it sounded like a lot. And you made me
Yes.
start to think of other things that, things that add to my intersectionality I hadn't even considered. So I appreciate that. Anyone else want to share?
Yeah, I agree. What I love, even though this is kind of a fairly new conversation, is that it addresses the elephant in the room. I mean, all of us, even here as panelists, we have to go through life with all of these different intersections, visibly representative in the way that we do life. I can't wake up and take off my Blackness any more than I can my gender. And as Rachel said, people can assume what they want about sexuality or even gender, but there's this elephant in the room that we have to have the conversation about how all of that affects not only my life, but how I engage other people that it affects as well. For me, I'm an entrepreneur, right? So I'm in the business space, and it's middle-aged, white, male dominated. And for so long, the nuance in social interaction is to come into the room apologetic about having to create space at the table, apologetic about what I might not know and what you might assume about my level of knowledge. And intersectionality says, no, that's actually not a deficiency. That's not anything harmful, right? That's actually a part of what makes me a good contributor to the conversation. And not only do I have to address that, but you have to address that as well. And so it's a difficult conversation, again, as Rachel said, but it's necessary.
So there are some historical contexts. So while we just coined the term in the late 80s, navigating identities and I think struggles in some ways is not new to us. And, we talk about the civil rights and feminist movements, historical occurrences, but the thing that comes to mind for me most is specific to Black women. And when we were navigating the suffrage movement, Black women had to make a decision on whether or not they wanted to put their effort toward making with the 15th Amendment toward enfranchising Black men, or really putting their effort toward making sure that women, predominantly white women, would be considered less inferior. And that seems to always, Black women seem to always be at the intersection of having to choose, and it is usually always at our own detriment and sacrifice. What do you think about like history and intersectionality, and maybe how Black women have had to navigate this framework of uplifting Black people, which tends to uplift Black men first, but then also walk in their womanhood, which is also another marginalized identity that requires advocacy and activism?
Well, I will say, Chrissy, that the thing is, especially since you brought up, I would say, the historical context, I think is also the way a lot of us as Black women, we actually are socialized, right? So a lot of time, especially as women, I would say we are socialized to take the burden, right? I will say, and also this is also a lot of stereotypes also that has been created, especially about Black women, and that we also even see in the workplace, where you either like the mommy in a sense, you also the superwoman, you taking up a cape, you wearing a cape, you cannot make any mistakes whatsoever. So I think a lot of time we have been conditioned to a certain extent to always place others before before us, I would say. I would say, but I think reshifting and rethinking, and I think that's pretty much what the history help us understand, because I think the history help us understand what happened in the past, the shortcomings that we made in the past, but also what do we envision that future to look like and to be, I would say.
Any other thoughts about history, Black women's burden?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm a strong believer that the feminism movement was never done with Black women in mind. They were not a part of that movement. Black men were specifically taken out of trials that would have given them life-saving medication. It was reserved for white gay men. And so there's this case out of General Motors from the 70s where these Black women filed a suit against their employer, and they sued on the basis of being Black and being female. And the court said, hey, you are entitled to something, but you're not going to create this super remedy of being Black and female. They made them choose, even though the fact that the lawsuit, it was very clear that it was a combination of discrimination on both causes. So we still have a lot of work to do, because again, movements, even today in 2024, Black women are forced to create their own space, their own movements, their own marches, to get the needle to move. Like, we're not part of the larger conversation.
Is it a martyrdom, Andrina? Is it that, you know, we don't get to win because there's always another entity that we need to uplift into their liberation, even across our own intersectionality?
I think so. Unfortunately, Chrissy, I think so. You know, one of the things that really bothers me is this narrative of the strong Black woman, because I think it's crippled us for so long, and it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy in so many spaces for us, where martyrdom is the standard now. And if we're not martyrs for something, then that means that we're not walking in our ultimate Blackness or Black womanness. And I think it's unfortunate. And I think there's a part of me that wonders whether or not that will change. So for me, I'm juggling this kind of bicultural experience where I've been in America since I was 9 years old, but I'm still very much Sierra Leonean. And so uplifting the Black man or the African man is not only an expectation, I've been reared that this is kind of the standard for me. And so when I'm talking about intersectionality and whether or not I come first or second, that's half the challenge for me, is figuring out what that conversation looks like if I am a martyr. And what does that create a new lane in the intersection for me? So I think it's unfortunate, Chrissy, but yeah, I think it is a martyrdom.
Now I'm going to ask you all probably a little bit of a controversial question, and you can probably guess where I land on this one. But does the fight for intersectionality and recognition of other areas of disadvantage dilute the fight that Black people need to fight for anti-Blackness?
I don't think it dilutes the fight. But again, back to your martyrdom question, I think it reprioritizes it. The fight will always be what it is. And we're reminded of that every single day at every corner. But again, it's constantly making an intentional decision about what space do I want to be in. So if I walk into a boardroom and there's one of me and 3 Black men in a room full of 10 people, if I don't support the 3 Black men in the room, then all of a sudden I'm counterproductive, right? I'm harmful to the overall progress of what we're trying to do with representation, overall representation for Black people in the boardroom. So yeah, I think it's a matter of priorities sometimes, but I don't think it ever dilutes the fight.
I love that you use the word prioritization, because I actually do. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And a lot of times when I'm speaking on the issue, you'll hear me say things like, we believe, especially at Associated Black Charities, but that there go Black people, thereby go Black people, go all of the other marginalized communities. We believe if we can make life better and more just and fair for Black people, that it will then be better for queer people, for non-Christian people, for old people, for, you know, all of these other identities. And I firmly believe that. But sometimes I do wonder if the landscape of All Lives Matter and What About Me sometimes takes the needed attention off of Black people as a generationally marginalized, body of people who just, I think, have, number one, a different relationship to white supremacy as some of the other isms, and need 100% of the force and fight behind our causes. So any other thoughts on that? And please disagree with me if
Oh.
that is your will.
No, because I actually really love the question, right? Because I have to think about it from like a systemic issue, then I think about it from a personal issue. So from a personal stance, again, I could walk down the street and I don't know whether I could be attacked or berated on the fact of being a Black person or the person like, or whose hand I'm holding. And those two things are very close knit. And I do believe that I can fight for, queer equality and queer equity and do the same because I can't take away those identities. But and then I do realize that sometimes when I'm like, hey, if we fight really hard for like work in anti-racism spaces, that possibly things could get better. But then I also have to realize the discrimination that I feel with even in the Black community when like, oh yeah, like you can't be queer and be Black, you can't be atheist and be Black. So I also do struggle with understanding like, would it really get better for everyone? I'm not sure, but I do think that this work is founded in anti-racism work. I think it's the foundation, and right, it is a priority. So I think it is the basis of everything that I do, and I build from there. But those things are for me very, very separate, and they are fights that I have to fight. I turn on the news every day. There's anti-trans laws being passed at a just ridiculous rate. So I can't like dismiss that part of my identity and like the need to fight even in that space as well.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Alexandra?
Yeah, I was going to add to what Rachel mentioned that anti-Blackness is actually global. It's everywhere. So it's not like if you go outside of the United States, like for instance, I'm a Haitian immigrant. So it's not like if you go outside the United States, automatically or visit another country that the anti-Blackness does not exist. It's actually global. But I do think understanding those layers, and I think that's where intersectionality help us sort of understanding how they show up because they show up differently. So for instance, you will find Blackness in all those particular layers. So you will find people who are queer and Black. You will find those particular layers and stuff like that, but they show up differently. So it allows us to assess and identify how they show up and to know, I think to add what Andrina mentioned, how we can actually prioritize and how we can diagnose and prioritize it, whether locally and globally, I would say.
Thank you for that. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges that are faced specifically in the workplace by Black people due to intersecting identities, and some that we can think of. Obviously, we've talked about Black women and how the intersection of race and gender show up as traumatic for them. I will say, when we talk about wage and pay equity, in Maryland right now, women earn 86 cents to every dollar a man makes. Race not quantified, right? Women, 86 cents to every dollar that a man makes. But in Maryland, Black women earn 67 cents to every dollar a white man makes. And so we know that this intersection of race and gender for Black people, Black women specifically, has far-reaching effects in the workplace around pay equity, around promotional opportunity, around a lot of things. But what other challenges do we know that people face, Black people in the workplace, due to intersectionality? I'm assuming it's all the regular stuff, right? Like all the regular stuff that is.
Yeah, it is. I think, like navigating, not being coined the angry Black woman, when I'm just being passionate. I've had Latina, Latinx friends who've like been accused of being too family devoted. The idea of professionalism being centered around whiteness. Again, when I walk in a room, people don't think I do what I do. They're like, oh, you're an artist, you're an industry worker. I mean, it's like you can't have natural hair, you can't, you have to talk a certain way. there's a sense of you just not being comfortable being authentic, wearing your hair how you want to wear it, speaking how you want to speak. You mentioned the wage gap. I mean, and when we even think about it, again, bigger, like Native American, Indigenous women, I think it's like 60 cents for every dollar earned by white, non-Hispanic men. I mean, it just, again, it's so layered. But I think obviously the most glaring one are the wage disparities. That's data driven, that's tangible, that's beyond just a feeling, that's hard. That's the math. The math is just there. It lets us know that we are different and we continue to see more gaps and more disparities based on, again, the more layers of intersectionality a person may hold.
One thing you mentioned, Rachel, that I'd love to delve into a little more, and I hadn't considered this before that, but perhaps intersecting identities make it harder for Black people to coexist the same way that we always do, right? Like, because now we have other considerations in the workplace. So we talked about, Andrina, like walking into the room, there's Black people and you're expected to support them unilaterally, right? But because of these other intersecting identities, there may be other things that we just don't agree on within our own Blackness, right? Like we talked about Christianity being the dominant, religious expectation, or, heterosexuality or whatever. And so do those things show up in a way that make it harder even for us to stay aligned in workplaces? I'm just wondering.
I think so.
Yeah.
So? So, and I was going to say, before we even get to the data and the disparities about wage and, resource accessibility, for me, the conversation starts at representation. So, imposter syndrome is amplified at intersectionality. So, whereas I have to consider, again, my Blackness, my gender, all of these things, the minute I start to consider, because I do identify as a Christian, that there might be some assumptions about what that means about my politics, about my behavior, about maybe ways I'm discriminating against other people, all of a sudden my behavior means, I have to kind of shrink back a bit as I'm considering all of these different intersections. And so representation is one kind of into figuring out, how do I navigate this room? Because if there are differences between me and the other Black people in the room, again, how do I prioritize whether I'm going to collaborate with these people, or whether or not I'm going to stay true to all of these things that are unique to my intersection, so that I don't dilute, what's important to me, to use the word that you used earlier. And again, there are nuances to this, but it's not always easy. It's not always black and white. For me, a lot of times I think that racial connection trumps some of the other things based on the context of the room, but it's a subconscious decision or an unintentional decision that we constantly have to make. Earlier, you mentioned the historical context. And I think that's one of the things that separates us from the feminist movement and all the other movements, is that others don't have to consider those things before the conversation even starts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, and I think to add to what Gina mentioned is also, because even when before the representation itself, it's also depending on the field that you're currently in. Like, for instance, in my case, I am in the humanities. There's not a lot of Black people in the humanities. So when you show up, because even as a kid, you don't see a lot of representation. You don't see in terms of leaderships or anything in between. So even when you show up in that particular room, usually there's barely of us in that particular room talking and discussing about cultural preservation, what does that mean, and all these things. And sometimes you have to sort of navigate, I would say the room, because on the one hand, you want to make sure that you sort of align with the person, but at the same time, you also have your own values as well in making those particular decisions. And sometimes you can make decision and you push for decision that is totally different than somebody else. That can be from different than somebody who's also Black as well.
Absolutely. And in the chat, it says we have our own isms and phobias to address in the Black community. That's certainly true. Rachel.
And I was actually going to comment on that. I mean, I think that's every community. Every community has their isms and their phobias. I mean, I've walked into a room to do a DEI training and I've been told, like, I'm not Black enough. Like, oh, you're too light skinned, give me the, light skin privilege again, which I I acknowledge exist. You know, I lean into, you know, and understand that colorism is a real thing. You know, again, if I happen to in the moment have a male partner, I'm not queer enough for the queer community. Every community has the isms and the phobias that we, you know, are hopefully working towards, you know, rectifying to have more unity, because I do think unity is a huge key for us to like approach this, you know, as a team, you know, because there's people are capitalizing on the division within the community. They want us to be against each other. They want that division within the Black community, within the gay community, within all the communities. So I think, you know, being united in this idea of like treating people like humans, and, you know, and respecting our difference, cherishing our differences, valuing those things, and knowing that we learn and we're better because of them is just going to be so key in just moving this forward in a way that works.
And you're absolutely right. It's not only key, it's essential. It's mandatory. And I feel like, you know, I'm one of those people, and I've gotten the light skin stuff and, you know, all this stuff. But I feel like, I don't care how you show up. We went down the list of all the different intersectionalities. I could care less how old you are, disabled, who you love, any of those things. When I start singing the first 3 words of Lift Every Voice, that's the rallying cry. Come on, we all together. Like, I don't care how else you show up, what your intersections are. It's time to do what we need to do, because we cannot afford to have a fractured community. We cannot afford to dismiss people. And I tell people all the time, it's a little crass, but I always say, like, you still gonna get like brutalized by the police when you get pulled over, then you are a member of the community, right? Like, no matter how else you show up or how else you your identities lie. And so I just think what you said is so important. We cannot have the division, because we don't have enough privilege to sustain with division in our Black community. But let's hear a little bit about your direct lived experiences. So we have wonderful immigrant women here. We have queer and non-gender conforming women. We have all kinds of things. I heard you say neurodivergent. Like, I mean, there are all kind of identities on the line. How has your experience in the workplace around all the ways that you are and who you are and how you show up, what have your lived experience been navigating your intersectionality at work, whether they were positive experiences or troublesome ones? We'd love for you to share. And please, if you're watching, share yours in the chat as well.
Extremes, right?
Yeah.
And I guess the assumption is this is the good extreme. I've experienced a lot of tokenism. You know, you walk into the room and you fit all the boxes, they can check mark it. And so you're the person that they push to the front and they give the opportunity to. And I've been able to leverage some of those opportunities, you know, for my own advantage, and I'm hoping for the advantage of the greater good of our community as Black people. So that's the extreme of the good things. Bad things, I think we can all probably share similar stories. So the assumption at the door that you're not quite educated, eloquent, articulate enough, you might not know what you're talking about. Rachel mentioned colorism. As a dark-skinned woman, right, having to navigate this assumption that I'm an angry Black woman, or that I'm an angrier Black woman because I'm dark-skinned, and all that comes with that, you know, having to smile extra hard all the time. And I grew up in New Jersey, right? So I grew up in the North, where we have the resting face all the time. But you know, the nuance again of just social interactions. For me, I'm in the nonprofit space, and the statistics say only 6% of nonprofit board chairs are Black women. And so I'm having to fight that fight every time I go in and sit with a client, and to say, I am at the intersection of Blackness, I am at the intersection of womanhood, right? I do know what I'm talking about. And not only can I tell you what you can do better, even though you don't look like me, and you want to undermine the fact that you don't think I can do this job, but I'm also hoping to create space for other people to come behind me who are also at their various intersections. So, you know, I've had extremes.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
I'll say it's something I've struggled to navigate for a very long time. And while there are moments that I still today question my identity and my behavior and how it affects how people perceive me, I'm far more unapologetic about how I show up nowadays. I mean, it's definitely has been a process. It's been a journey. Being a person of color, you know, identifying me being Black, being non-binary queer, you know, I'm always concerned that, again, when I'm passionate, I'm being seen as angry. If I'm open about my relationship dynamic, I'm being viewed as trying to push like a queer agenda. You know, again, I mentioned I'm atheist. I previously worked for an organization that started every board meeting with a prayer. So it's just like this daily sense of like not fitting in, the sense of othering, because people naturally gravitate to those like them. Again, normal human thing to do, nothing wrong with it, but that's just the way it is. So in navigating intersectionality at work, for me, there's just always an underlying feeling of, again, what part won't someone like? Where, you know, where's the microaggression going to come in? Because they may think, oh, in this safe space, I'm talking to a Black woman, that I'm going to make some snide comment about a trans person or a person, again, who has a disability, not realizing like that's also, those are also my peeps. That's my community too. And, you know, I mean, I advocate for everyone, you know, so to say anything, there's no safe space with me. You know, if you say something off the wall, we're gonna have a problem. So, just I never know when it's gonna happen, who's gonna hold bias. It's a lot, it's never ending. And sometimes, again, I talked about it, there's no community within the community that I'm a part of. So again, there's expectations of me as a person of color, as a queer, to fit neatly in a box. And that can just result in me being an outsider within, you know, my group. But I think because now I show up unapologetic, I've learned that diversity is beautiful. It has made me resilient. It has made other people resilient. And the fact that we're all, like, everyone here is dynamic and complex. I don't know, to me, it's a beautiful thing. I wish more people leaned into it. I think, you know, for me, finally accepting that, and, you know, it's made me a better person, and again, made me happier at work because I'm not trying to hide things about myself.
Alexandra?
Yeah, so I would say, I think it's also very similar, where you sort of, I think I was reading this particular article. I think the author was also talking about like how Black women are considered like from pet to threat, in a way. So when you actually arrive in the workforce, I feel like you kind of like have that particular honeymoon phase, because a lot of the time they get you, because you did something amazing. So I think that's one of the reason you are into those particular space. And I think also I think similar to what Andrina mentioned, like there's also this idea, especially in my case, I am also an immigrant woman. So you also gotta have like this particular good model immigrant tropes sometimes. And when you start pushing back, when you start, for instance, I will pretty much say like it is. I will challenge things. I will advocate for policies. And I will say, we need to do better here. This is the reason why we need this. And sometimes being okay that you are the Black sheep in the room, basically, and being okay with that. Because sometimes it happens where you might say something that differ from what people may be thinking or the company is currently thinking, but you might say, hey, I don't think this is the right direction that we need to take. And you become a threat in a way. And I think when you reach that particular phase where you become that particular threat, you'll start experiencing like toxic work environment. Sometimes it might be a lot of microaggressions that you also might experience. And also sometimes, for instance, in my case, I know that they actually have views, me being an immigrant, that I don't understand. Like, I don't understand English as a language, even though I speak more than 3 languages. In terms of pushing policies, right? To say, oh, you didn't understand it because you didn't read it completely, and so on. So there's also that particular dynamic that actually exists where you sort of get that particular honeymoon phase in a way. And then, but you show up, but I think based on those particular experience, I also show up as myself and being
So
myself.
based on what you just said, and something Rachel said about, you know, feeling free to show up authentically, there's this whole movement of showing up to work authentically in intersectional identities, but also just as Black people. And so I'm going to play devil's advocate and ask you, like, there are some ways, right? Like, we can't leave Black at home. It's visible. I can't leave, in some cases, I can't leave my gender identity at home, depending how I choose to display. But there are some things that some people would say, why do you have to be that authentic at work? Again, devil's advocate, I don't feel this way, but some people would say, why lessen your privilege by feeling the need to share everything about yourself? Why not come to work, leave what you can outside the door, do the job, and go home? Like, why do people need to know what church or religion you belong to? Or why do people need to know who you love? Or why do people need to know what your socioeconomic status is, or these things, when you know that the spaces are not built to protect those things? So what do you say to those kind of thoughts?
Well, what I want to say is, I'm not going to say it on this webinar, but with that being said, diplomatically, I will always take issue with that, because again, it's centered around the majority. That is privilege in itself, is that I don't have to think about talking about my partner because my partner happens to be the opposite gender. So people freely talk about their husbands, their wives, again, their Christian religion, and they do so without even thinking about it, and don't even realize how much of a privilege that is. And so if you don't want me to come to work and have to sit here and code switch, or again, overthink these, I should be there to do a job and not have to play the tape through of like, did I share too much, or was I too authentic? Because again, there's people who every day get to be authentic and don't have to think about it. And I think that's something that we should all be afforded. We should all be able to embrace who we are as individuals, and it just be second nature. And it's done without a snide look or an extra comment. I mean, that would be a beautiful world, right? If we could just all just be who we are and not have to worry about it beyond that.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think in addition to awareness that Rachel mentioned, I think showing up as yourself is a form of advocacy. And I think, what happens when you advocate so openly is you create opportunity for other people to be able to show up for themselves as well. And you start to create community and affinity groups, and all of those things are beneficial to the employer. And then I think about the impact of having to stifle parts of yourself on your mental health. And productivity. If I'm an employer and I want my employees to show up as their best selves and be productive for my bottom line, even though I might not care about all the different parts of them, if I'm primarily concerned about my bottom line, then whatever it takes for you to be highly productive is what I need to create room for. And so showing up authentically as yourself does promote that. So it's a win, I think. I think it does more good than harm for folks to be authentic.
Well, one of the things that we wanted to explore, and you just brought it up, was some of the mental health impact of intersectional discrimination. And one of the things that the research talks about is just chronic stress and anxiety, and the stress of constant vigilance. That you have to be hyper aware of potential biases, microaggressions that ultimately lead to chronic stress, because you're always persistently worried about being discriminated against, which increases your anxiety. You all mentioned some examples of that. Do you have any others to share, or any thoughts about just stress and anxiety at the hands of constantly being vigilant about protecting yourself at work, of all places?
I mean, personally, I'd be remiss if I didn't just bring up trauma. It's trauma, it's traumatic, and it affects you to your very core. I mean, think about how good it feels to have confidence in something and to stand by it with everything you have. But when you have some of these intersectional, identities, it takes away your ability to feel safe. It hinders your ability to regulate your emotions, and then you have like secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. So when you think about like vicarious trauma, which, is the indirect trauma that we see, it really impacts my ability to navigate with other people. For example, like I sometimes find it very difficult to like Republicans, because every time I turn on the news, again, this is the vicarious traumatization, I see another anti-LGBTQIA bill. I see, taking away women's rights to do what they want with their body. I see a lot of Republicans painting people like me as scary, like we're grooming your children, we're coming into your bathrooms for vile reasons, other than I just need to use the restroom. And it takes away my ability to want to connect. It takes ability, because I'm starting to put people in a box of like, if you are this, you must feel this way. And so while trauma can be very unique to the individual, yeah, you talked about being hypervigilant, having this exaggerated fear of danger, increased reactivity, just a constant fear of just not if it's going to happen, but when is it going to happen? And yeah, that's a lot to worry about because you're already doing it in your personal life. And then I got to also come deal with it at work. That's a lot. I mean, I'm going to have anxiety. I'm going to be depressed. I'm not going to have a good self-esteem. I may, obviously people who have intersecting identities have higher use of drug and alcohol use. So there's a lot that comes with it.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think part of the way white supremacy itself is actually structured is always about othering the other, and stuff like that. And I think because of this, when you actually meet someone, it helps sort of deconstruct to a certain extent the ideas they might have about certain things. But I do think, especially when you're at work, you also don't want to keep negotiating the different aspects. So I think also it takes a mental toll on you. You do have a mental load, and it's visible. It can also be invisible because something may happen at work, for instance. And when something happened at work, sometimes you have to go after work. Sometimes it happens, you have to talk to somebody else about this. You may talk to your therapist about this. It also might be the mental load you have to do, the mental labor you have to do to respond an email, or depending on the interaction you actually have. So all those particular things adds up, and it creates stress. It creates stress to your bodies and stuff like that. And I think it's also not surprising, even in the workplace, when you see a lot of Black women raising to, even I always say one of my experiences also in academia, where you actually seeing them in those particular leadership roles and stuff like that, or even then sometimes they ended up dying quickly. That's one of the things that sometimes happen. Or also they ended up also being sick as well, because there are so many things that you also have to deal with, and stress that you have to deal with, in the ways you actually have to negotiate, because there's always a gymnastics that you also have to do, I would say, in a way.
Recently I've been exploring the difference in the concept of work-life balance and what that means. And this new thing I don't know that I've coined it. I think I heard it from someone and now it's my new thing, called work-life harmony. And it really is, I heard someone say that we spend so much of our day, our time and attention at work, that sometimes the thought is that we need to escape that in order to be our true selves, live our lives, enjoy our families, enjoy, the things that life has to offer. But when you're doing something that is fulfilling, there's a way to establish work-life harmony so that it doesn't have to be it's 5:01, I'm shutting this down, and now I could get to be who I want to be, do the things I like to do. But you find a way in a fulfilling job to integrate who you are, what fulfills you, what you want to be, how you want to show up, how you can uniquely contribute in a way that is more harmonious than listen, it's 5:01, I'll see you tomorrow at 9:00. What do you guys think about that? We talked a little bit about hiding your intersectionality, hiding who you are and your identities is not good for the bottom line of a job anyway, because you're not going to be most productive. You're not going to be your best self. What does it look like to really establish harmony between who you are, what you have passion over, and what you can bring to the table because of who you are, that will help you have better results in the workplace? What does that look like?
Someone figures it out. I would love to know. Because I struggle. And if I could kind of just go back to the previous question, Chrissy, I think it ties into this question. For me, the hardest part about the mental health challenges is stress, is exactly what we were just talking about. But here's the thing, because I lead a faith-based nonprofit, I identify as a Christian. The assumption is I'm a one-issue voter. I'm conservative. I might be Republican, right? That's what people assume. And as an entrepreneur, my number one concern at all times is cash flow. And there have been so many times that we've created and developed a dynamic program. We have the data that proves that we're having impact. And a funder will say, well, because you identify as a Christian organization, we cannot fund you. And so they'll disregard all of the other intersections that I'm at and our organization is at because of that one issue. And that is extremely stressful. And so while I have harmony because I love what I do, it's the one thing I would do if I never got paid for it. That one intersection defines everything else. And so, it's a challenge. I'm still figuring out what that looks like. But for me, the harmony would be if I didn't have to figure out how intersectionality affects everything else that makes my work sustainable, mainly finances. If it were just me just not having anything, bills to pay, employees to pay, I think I could do this forever. But the intersection defines so much.
What's
and so, yeah, it
available
ties,
to you. Yeah.
yeah, that mental health piece too.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Yeah.
I will say I think it's also complicated. For instance, I am in the humanities, so I'm also in nonprofit. So in the humanities context, you don't have a lot of representation. So that also means while at my job, we try to actually have a work-life balance where after certain times, people will message you, will not call you. We know it's over. It's time for people to rest.
Doesn't work at Associated Black Companies.
You do get also a lot of that particular flexibility, but at the same time, after work, there's also some of the things that I would say struggling in navigating saying no sometimes, because sometimes you also have, there's this specific projects that people actually need your insights, your research, your support to guide them, because by supporting this specific project, we know in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, how you're actually going to impact some communities and stuff like that. So because of this, I feel like now, yes, you may be at work, but I think because also some of those layers, I would say, of your intersectionality, being able to navigate and also sometimes saying no and understanding, like sometimes you also have to prioritize your body. You have to prioritize yourself, I would say. I think this is where the struggle is.
Yeah. And that really resonated for me, Alexandra, because I think that also plays a part, like tying it back into intersectionality, is that there is this need for me to work harder than everyone else because I'm a person of color, because I'm queer, because I'm neurodivergent. So I know saying no is difficult because people don't necessarily see your value, that I have to show you my value and I have to show you that because I'm going to outwork and outperform everyone in the room, even if it's to the detriment of my mental health or my physical health, because always feeling like I'm in a place that I need to prove something. So yeah, I don't know what that looks like either. So if anybody figures it out, I'll share an email address. Please let me know. But yeah, it definitely
I will
is
tell you this. I can't say I have figured it out because I'm not the best at work-life balance in the sense of like preserving my physical, getting rest and doing those things. I haven't figured that piece of it out. But what I have figured out is how to bring my whole self to my work. So people probably wouldn't know this, and they probably might not even want to hear this. But if you look at Associated Black Charities and how it shows up now, it shows up as who I am. Like as the leader, it is literally who I am. Everything that we do reflects of who I am, what I value, how I want to lead, how I have, because I have to spend so much time at work doing the work of the organization, I've married it to the things I like to do, the ways I like to show up. And so when you see us host events, they reek of like what I enjoy, right? When you see me out speaking on panels, I tend to speak from the lens of how I really feel and what matters to me, because that's valuable. And so I do feel like I've found some synergy in how to have the harmony in the work and like who I am now, the rest and all that kind of stuff. I agree is as an area of growth. I do come from that generation of twice as hard. That is hard to break. I'm not even sure I want to break it anymore. I'd leave that to y'all younger than me to figure that part out. I'm just gonna work hard to create pathways for you to come in authentically and to not email back at 501. But
We're
for
probably
me,
the same age, Chrissy. I mean, like,
oh, I know. I'm gonna say I'll leave that to y'all young folks to figure out, because I will say this new generation, they not only want to be authentic, they want every second of, but also, it begs the question of how successful they're able to be, right? There is such freedom. And I will tell you this, and we'll move on. I have built my career in white spaces ahead of this. I did not know I was not free. I was constantly code switching. I was constantly adapting. I was constantly weathering and othering and doing all of the things. And you do not know what freedom is like until you really get it, right? And so I encourage the people that I mentor to do a little bit more now, because once you get a taste of freedom, where you get to, create something that fulfills you, that is more valuable to me than being so rigid that I can't reply at 5:01 today, right? Like I have goals in mind. So anyway, I share that, but let's let's move on about what professionals can do to advocate for themselves. I always wonder, like, I'm not always the biggest fan of employee resource groups. However, I wonder, in an employee resource group society, where do I go? Like I have, if Rachel, specifically, you shared a number of identities, right? Like do you go to all of them, or do you pick one? You're like, how do you show up for groups in advocacy settings where you have to like double down on something on a cause, something like employee resource groups?
well, like you, I have some interesting opinions on employee resource groups, and I believe in them, but I don't feel like they're built in the way they should be, built. They're underfunded. Again, you're asking people to usually drive it and champion it for nothing other than just, because it's the right thing to do. And so I don't show up.
Okay, all right.
But I do believe that you just have to show up as yourself. You have to take space. You do have to make time for self-care. You have to have self-affirmations. Remind yourself that you deserve to be in that room. And when I think about other people, whether that's a high organizational level or how we can be better leaders, better managers, better coworkers, I always tell people, show up with respect, show up with curiosity, compassion, kindness. And while this is not perfect by any means, if you haven't read on the contact hypothesis, it's really about breaking down those biases by having consistent contact with those people who are different than ourselves. Every time that we do that, we move the needle just a little bit every time. So, like you talked about mentoring, I try to walk the walk. Well, that's kind of an ableist comment. I try to, live by what I state, and I try to mentor people in the same way. And again, really it's about, creating spaces for exposure and getting to know people, and again, just leaning into curiosity, leaning into getting to know, again, people who are just not like me.
I love that. And I hope we all leave this with that in mind, because there are so many ways that we can expose ourselves to people that maybe don't align with our values and beliefs, but still have value. One of the ways that I choose to do that is in my community service. So I'm, of course, part of the Associated Black Charities and the Black Leadership Circle, but I'm also on the Executive Alliance because I know the plight of women, and I serve on the board of the ARC. For people with developmental disabilities. And I serve on the board at Center Stage, where we constantly are talking about degendering and what it means to be, inclusive that way. And so it is really fulfilling to learn, even though I don't identify in the ways of people that I come across, it's great to learn about them. My staff at ABC about 6 weeks ago attended a Jewish Seder at the invitation of one of our community partners. And we went and we enjoyed it, and we found the synergies between what they were putting forward and what our values and beliefs are, and found synergies that I think strengthen us as people and in our partnership. I'd love to hear from you, Andrina.
Yeah, I think I'm a big believer in mentoring as well. And I think at whatever level you are in your workplace, it's important that you be a part of the decision-making process. You mentioned earlier, Chrissy, freedom. So
Freedom.
last year, freedom, it's really important. Last year, I cut off all my hair. So if you all saw the flyer, you saw a girl with like
Yeah, I
long
know who that
black
was.
hair. And I cut off all my hair and I dyed it blonde. And believe it or not, it was the first time in 38 years of living that I actually felt free to just show up as myself, right? And what I realized though is, you know, in conversations about even hair politics, right, in the workplace, this was important to some people to see someone who was a CEO title, a C-suite leader, to just look like them and be unapologetic about it. And so whether it's small decisions like that, like showing up authentically, or in our marketing material, for example, we're very inclusive in the types of people that we have as representations of the work that we do. And so what that says to our constituents is there's a space for you here. And again, that's a form of advocacy as well. But whatever level you are, I think at work, it's important that you try to be part. I think it's helpful, not important, but I think it's helpful to be part of the decision-making process in an effort to create safe spaces for other people as much as you can.
Any thoughts, Alexandra?
Yeah, I think it's also very similar. I think I like to always pay attention to the little details, because I think a lot of time, a lot of organization like to think about the big picture, which is good, I would say. For instance, creating a mission statement, and saying, okay, this is what we need to do and stuff like that. But it's always a day-to-day interaction where people always feel the tension and the awkwardness. So I always pay attention to those little, I would say, details in terms of considering how do we do our hiring practices, for instance. Is that the best way? And who's not in the room? Because if all of us are in the room and all we all, yes, we may have different I would say identities, but sometimes you may have other people who may not be in the room. So how can we make sure we actually have different voices in that particular room, so we can actually make inclusive we can actually establish inclusive policies that's going to be better for everyone. So I think it's also asking these questions, and sometimes asking uncomfortable questions as well, so we can actually keep pushing, so we can actually get there, I would say.
You talk about developing inclusive policies, and one of the things we know, of course, is DEI training, DEI work in the workforce is still important, still relevant. But one of the things the research suggested was data collection. I'm interested in knowing how you all feel about this. It talks about the importance, if you want an organization that can and will change their policies that support intersectionality, it's important for them to collect and analyze demographic data so that they can first understand the composition of their workforce. What do you think about that?
I wholeheartedly agree. I think that we can be very passionate and very emotionally driven by this work, a lot of times based on who we are as individuals. But we, again, I say this all the time, we're not and shouldn't be in the business of feels. We need to be able to have actual numbers that show that our initiatives are making an impact. Otherwise, we are being kind of savior complex, that we know what's best. We're the ones like making the decision on how the organization moves forward, and we're not amplifying the voices of the people that we should be amplifying. So I think getting baseline data, being able to kind of look at where we're at, where we're going, and redirect, move differently, pivot when needed. And a lot of times that has to be driven by the numbers.
Mm-hmm. Thoughts?
I think my thoughts, I would say, on this are mixed. I think the reason being, I feel like there's sometimes organization always like to use, in order for us to prove there's racism, we need to also collect and show that we have data to show this. And I think a lot of the time it prevents change, because I feel like it's also like you create busy work in a sense, where to say, in order for us to do this, we need to sort of know we are sure that this particular thing actually happened. We need to have proof that this actually thing happened and stuff like that. But all the evidence sometimes are already there. So one of the things for instance, in my case, I always like to use the demographic data of the state. So if we have this demographic data in the state, why it is not represented in all those particular spaces that we actually have? Do I need to go in, especially as an organization, to collect that information when we already know it already exists? So now the questions for me is, if, for instance, in my programming, like how intentional we are when we are dealing with different communities, are they included in the decision-making process? So are we going in and are we showing up? And I think that sort of deal with this complex, like the savior complex that sometimes organization may have, to say we know best, but are they part of the decision-making process right at the beginning? Are they involved when we're asking questions, when we're making those particular decisions? Do we have them there and they are co-creating with us and stuff like that? So I think for me, in a way, yes, data is important to actually showcase the impact. But I think at the same time, I always like to be cautious about it, because I think sometimes it can be weaponized. So that organization don't make change, or leaders don't, like, kind of like hide behind like of the needs of always constantly to prove something happened or anything like that. So they don't make decision in the organization and things stay the same. So, and that's why I'm always cautious about this.
I feel the same. I have mixed feelings about it. I think when it's used correctly, for example, with hiring, it's helpful, right? So it shows where the lack is and the deficiencies are. But I think data often leads to rigidity in a way that's not helpful. So you couldn't meet the quota of having X amount of Black people and women and whomever, but it's not going to pick up on culture. It's not going to pick up on microaggression. So what is the experience of the people, though you've met the quota? So I think it depends. It depends on how it's used. I think if you make good leadership decision, if an organization makes good leadership decision, and that includes leaders who are intentional about hiring policies that are representative of various groups, then it can be helpful.
Now, I know, and we talked about funding earlier, like specifically with nonprofit organizations, a couple of years ago, the funding process changed where now they're asking those kind of demographic questions. I've filled out so many applications at this job and previous ones where I had to give my age, my race, my marital status, how my sexual orientation and whatever else. And I think those were initially probably laid out as data collection mechanism to ensure inclusivity, but now are really just check box type things, right? Because I can be a Black leader of an organization that does no Black work, that does nothing to uplift Black communities. But if I identify as a Black leader in your application, you can check the box and say that you funded a Black leader, even though my organization is not committed to Black communities. And so I do agree, it's used correctly, it can be a great, I think, indicator of whose voice is not at the table, which I think organizations really do need to look at. But let's talk really quickly, and then we'll transition into a little bit of closure. What about comfortability in the workplace? So we all show up differently. And I always I heard you say, Rachel, that you were part of an organization where they offered prayer, and that was not something you necessarily subscribe to. I consult with organizations and I tell them all the time, like, got to be careful with holidays, right? Like if you're going to post for Christmas, did you also post for, Hanukkah or, Kwanzaa or these other things? And sometimes it's better not do it at all. Just say season's greetings and keep it pushing. What about those things, those ways that workplaces show up, and how can they do better, I think, to be less exclusive and less offensive to employees that may not subscribe to the, what is the average way or the predominant way that people tend to show up? What can they do better around those things?
That's the $1 million question, Chrissy, because to be honest with you, it's a darned if you do, darned if you don't situation. You try to be as inclusive as possible, and then the one thing you miss, and then everything comes crumbling down around you because, I didn't acknowledge, or I didn't, bring to attention. I can't remember the exact number, but you're right, how many religions are there in the world? And so I think for me, I try to, promote self-education and diversity, equity, inclusion, right? It's not a department. It's supposed to be a practice, a way we do business. So to not put it on one person or one department, but to just like create an inclusive environment and that just be in every last one of us. And so I've encouraged organizations to like get to know your staff. You know, when you have onboarding, figure out about what they enjoy, their culture, even if, you know, even if they do subscribe to a religion, how do they practice? Because that can vary from one to another. And so when you really take the time and are intentional about getting to know the people on your team, I think you can make it far more individualized versus trying to be very big picture in general, because you'll never capture
Everyone.
everyone. That's a losing battle, I think, in my opinion.
Mhm. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think I've come across a lot of organizations that think it starts with policy, and I actually think it starts with culture. Before we can talk about policy, is there a culture of openness? And these can be small things like a suggestion box, right? Like an employee appreciation where people can show up and represent whatever is most important to them. But is there a culture of openness where if I feel like I've suffered through any kind of discrimination or racism, there's protocol for me to be able to report that. Sometimes it's not as black and white. There are some organizations where people don't feel comfortable speaking up, not because they're afraid of, you know, being fired or being terminated, but because like the social response to that is bad enough. I can keep my job, but if I feel ostracized, then, you know, what does it matter? So I think it starts with culture as one small thing that incrementally over time makes a big difference.
I love that. But on the flip side of that, I also walk in the privilege right now of setting culture, which is really exciting to me. And even in our hiring, you know, like there's some things that are non-negotiable. So I tell people, you know, as you're navigating workspaces and wanting to be authentic and wanting to be fulfilled, sometimes you also have to find your tribe, right? And so you can work at Associated Black Charities, but you can't work here no matter what if you cannot speak unapologetically for Black people's causes and the ways that structural racism, you have to be able to use those words in order to work here, right? Like, because that is why we exist. And so that counts some people out, right? Like that might be really great at the technical skills of the job, that might be really great and have great expertise and experience, but just would not fit in the culture of what we're trying to achieve for the organization. Now, on the flip side of that, I got these people in there line dancing and doing the most, right? Like, and I had to even check myself, because when Halloween came around and we talked about different practices. I'm just a Christian as you want to be. But I was like, we're gonna dress up for Halloween. And I had employees that were like, I'm not dressing up for Halloween. And I'm like, well, why not? You know, so just thinking about, but also being willing, I think, to listen, but thinking about the different ways that people feel comfortable, but also having a culture sometimes that will address what you need to accomplish in your organization. And people understanding that sometimes the best fit is the one where you find your tribe, where people are doing work that you can positively contribute to and not always reject, because that is a downhill battle, I think, sometimes too.
Yeah. And if I can add, Chrissy, too, I think consistency in culture is really helpful too. Even if the consistency is we don't know what we don't know, and we are not afraid to admit that every day of the year. So until you tell us what we need to change, it won't change. I sometimes consult for churches, and I remember being so upset during the pandemic because at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, some were not vocal, right? But they were quick to be vocal about other things. So if we're gonna say we align with these social causes and that's a part of what informs our culture, then be consistent. So I think, yeah, consistency is really important.
Yeah, actually, I would say I agree, because I think it's actually is I think it's I would say it's actually I would say it's two process. So one is knowing yourself and knowing exactly where exactly you belong, because you're not gonna belong everywhere. So I think it's also understanding your values, knowing what's important to you, and so on. So I think that's one of the things. So you can know, okay, what is this particular place? It's a really great fit for me, and can I really be myself there? Because how I actually want to be might be very different than how somebody else actually wants to be. But I also think, like, for instance, for an organization, I think it even starts with the hiring process. Because if during the hiring process, I feel like I cannot even be myself, that you also telling me I cannot even be myself as an employee when I am there. So I think it's, how do you approach even the hiring process? Are you open? Are you flexible, right? Like, for instance, I know we sent like questions in advance, and stuff like that. Like, are you open? How are you thinking about this? How are you assessing folks and stuff like that? Are you making people go to a tedious process? And so on. What's very important here. And also, even when people are hired, what is that onboarding process looks like? Are you just dumping things on them, or are you giving time to protect themselves where they can actually really learn? And I think from there, people actually start opening up, because sometimes people also have not been exposed to a different type of environment, and they can even come to you and say, oh my God, I didn't even know this actually was even possible. And did you know I do X, Y, and Z, or I'm interested in X, Y, and Z and stuff like that. And I think this is where that particular culture start building in, and you also start learning about one another, I would say. So you need all of them to coexist, I would say, in a way.
Absolutely. And what I will say before we start our close is that I've been doing these webinars. This is one of the very first things we started doing when I came on board to move them to monthly. And so I've been doing now for a year and a half these Equity at Work webinars. And inevitably, what we come down to usually at the discussion is, if it's not working for you, get out. I swear to God, get out has been the most recommended thing across the webinars. Now, that might not be what you leave people with today, but we certainly don't want people to exist in spaces where their mental health is compromised, where their physical health is compromised, where they can't be free, where they feel low self-worth because of how they're being devalued. But what I'd like to ask each of you to do, and we'll go in the opposite order of how we did our introductions, is to leave the viewers with just some guidance or some insight on how they can navigate their own intersectionality at work, in life, or otherwise. And so we'll start tonight with Rachel.
Okay, well, that's and I guess no two people experience life in precisely the same way. Everybody is unique. And even we share common circumstances like birthplace, neighborhood, school. We all navigate distinct challenges through our lifetimes, and our social identity, which comes from like our race, gender, sexuality, religion, culture, makes us wholly distinct. Yet we often find solidarity with those who share, these defining traits. So again, I go back to connection, get to know people. And even though those like intersectional identities are different, kind of throw out the idea of like, throw it in the garbage. Cultural competency is a thing of the past. You cannot be competent on a group of people because that dismisses individual experience. And when you take in all the things that make you you, I mean, do the math. I mean, that's a lot. We're complex and dynamic, awesome people. So lean in, be curious, ask questions, listen to understand, listen to learn, educate yourself, do the work. But then understand, based on individuality, you may say the wrong thing. You're probably going to say the wrong thing. You're probably going to do the wrong thing. Apologize, do better, keep it moving, and follow the platinum rule. Treat people how they want to be treated. Don't treat people how you want to be treated.
I love that.
Treat people how they want to be treated.
Thank you so much for that. And Andrina.
I think Rachel said they said it perfectly, because I think about the intersections that I'm at, and I think about the people that I work with, but intersections change. And so if I form solidarity only based on what I am now, and ableism changes, disability changes for me at some point, then all of a sudden my identity, there are parts of my identity that change. But I think we kind of do away with some of that when we're intentional about getting to know people as they are and as they want to be treated. And I can't say it enough. Being and showing up unapologetically as yourself makes all the difference, no matter how afraid you might be. Because I've learned in the work that I do that you never know who's watching. And I think it's probably the same for all of us. You never know who you're setting an example for, especially with younger professionals that are coming up behind us. And by you just showing up, something as simple as cutting and dyeing my hair, I had no idea that a mentee of mine was going to be free enough to do the same thing at her internship. And it's like there's this ripple effect when we show up as ourselves and we treat people the way that they want to be treated, not as we assume we should treat them.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Alexandra.
Well, I would say, I think it starts with knowing yourself, knowing what your values are, what is actually important to you, I will say. And I think being a constant learner, I think what Rachel mentioned, actually being curious. I think that's one of the things people I think will need to be considered. Also knowing that I think in terms of using the concept of intersectionality, knowing the areas where you might be privileged, and when you are the privilege, like you have the privilege, advocate, because you have that privilege, advocate. And sometimes the areas where you may not have that privilege, listen. In being that particular space to listen to what that person is actually sharing. And if you don't know, also being able to actually go and learn and stuff like that. So I think these are the ways. And I think also, not because, for instance, in my case or other people, you actually may experience maybe work trauma, but how can we make sure that the other generation that's coming behind us don't experience these things as well in the workplace? How can we build a better workplace for them, I would say.
Absolutely. Thank you all so very much for not only your closing statements, but for all you contributed. I've learned so much in how to reframe how I talk about intersectionality and some of the, I think, challenges it brings forward for people and some of the concerns that we need to advocate against. So I appreciate all of you so very, very much. And thank you for being a part of Equity at Work. Thank you all so much as well who viewed tonight. And I would ask that you consider joining us in July, where our topic will be, I'm looking it up now, our topic will be, it's coming to me. Our topic, oh gosh, this is why it didn't come to me. Leveraging employee resource groups. And so I know one thing, I'll have a lot to say about those. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's Equity at Work for Associated Black Charities. I am Chrissy Thornton. Good night.